In July 1944, while Europe was still burning, the United States locked Europe into the dollar system, and the real bill for World War II was already being signed. Not in London, not in Paris. In Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, inside the Mount Washington Hotel, where 44 Allied nations sent delegates to decide what victory would mean in money. Because this is the part most people miss. The war was not only won on beaches and in bombed-out cities, it was won in balance sheets. And by 1944, the United States was not just winning the war, it was designing the cage Europe would live in afterward. To understand why Europe ended up tied to the dollar for generations, you have to start with a humiliating reality that hit long before the final gunshots. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. On paper, it was still an empire. A quarter of the world tinted pink on the map. But within months, Britain discovered the modern truth of total war. You do not just run out of men, you run out of money. By 1940, the war had become a machine that consumed steel, oil, aircraft, ships, rubber, food, and ammunition at a rate that made old imperial wealth feel fake. Britain could fight, but it could not pay. And the United States, officially neutral, had one rule: cash and carry. If you want American supplies, you pay cash immediately and you ship it yourself. No credit, no mercy, gold on the barrelhead. So Britain did what desperate countries always do. It liquidated its future. It sold overseas assets. It drained reserves. It moved wealth across the Atlantic into safer vaults. And the direction of that flow mattered, not just out of Britain, but into the financial orbit of the United States. By late 1940, Britain was running out of dollars. That is the nightmare behind Churchill's letters to Roosevelt. The British were not losing because they lacked courage. They were being forced to pay America's price to keep breathing. Then came Lend-Lease in 1941. It gets taught like a generous act, as if America had handed Europe a lifeline out of pure moral clarity. But Lend-Lease was also something else. It was leverage turned into structure. Because from that moment, the relationship hardened into a new rule of the modern world. Europe would fight. America would finance. And the accounting terms would decide who owned the post-war order. While Europe was converting factories into tanks and aircraft and rationing bread, the United States was doing something no bomb could stop. It was scaling industrial power behind an ocean, untouched, expanding, building, and stacking gold. By 1944, the United States held the leverage that matters in every system. It could say yes or no to the flow of dollars. And that brings us back to Bretton Woods. The war was not finished yet. France had been liberated, but Germany still fought. The Soviet Union was bleeding millions. Britain was exhausted. Much of Europe was physically shattered. And everyone in that hotel knew the same truth. When the war ended, Europe would be starving for imports, food, fuel, machinery, steel, rails, trucks, tools, medicine, everything you need to restart a continent. But after years of war, Europe did not have the one thing required to buy any of it: dollars. So Bretton Woods was sold as stability, fixed exchange rates, confidence restored, trade reopened, a clean new order after chaos. But look at what it actually did. Currencies would be pegged to the United States dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. In other words, Europe's money would revolve around America's money, and America would sit at the center of the wheel as the only country whose currency was treated like gold. That was the lock. Because once your currency is anchored to the dollar, your sovereignty becomes conditional. Your central bank policy becomes reaction. Your reserves become a question of whether you can obtain dollars. Your survival becomes tied to a system you do not control. And Bretton Woods did not just create a set of exchange rates, it created institutions to enforce the rules. The International Monetary Fund was built to police the system. The World Bank, originally called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was built to finance reconstruction inside the system. On paper, it was cooperation. In practice, it meant the rules of post-war money would be written inside an architecture designed and dominated by the only country with intact industry, surplus capacity, and the deepest pool of gold. And if you think Europe had a real choice, picture Europe in 1945. Cities flattened, rail lines destroyed, ports damaged, farms disrupted, trade routes shattered, coal shortages, food shortages. Industrial capacity bombed, dismantled, or redirected toward war production. Now add the brutal math. Europe still had to import essentials, but the world's buyer of last resort was the United States, and the invoice was denominated in dollars. That is why the real bill for World War II is not only measured in casualties, it is measured in currency, dependence, and the lock tightened fast. In September 1945, the war ends. Celebrations in the streets, relief across Europe. The nightmare is over. Then the financial blade drops. The United States ends Lend-Lease abruptly. Not gradually, not politely. Abruptly. Ships already loaded with supplies were ordered to stop. Contracts stopped. Credit stopped. The flow that Europe had been breathing through was cut off because the emergency had officially ended. And Europe immediately hit a wall economists later called the dollar shortage. Europe needed dollars to import what it could not produce. But it could not earn dollars fast enough through exports because its factories and logistics were wrecked, and its markets had been disrupted for years. So Europe did what trapped systems do. It borrowed. It complied. It accepted the terms of the new order because the alternative was hunger, chaos, and political breakdown. This is where the United States makes its most important move. It does not just help Europe rebuild. It rebuilds Europe inside a dollar framework. In 1947, the Marshall Plan is announced, the European Recovery Program. It is remembered as generosity, and yes, it helped prevent starvation and collapse. But structure matters more than sentiment. The Marshall Plan was roughly $13 billion in aid over several years, which is enormous for that era. But the deeper point is not the number. It is the routing. Europe receives dollars, then spends those dollars largely on fuel, food, machinery, vehicles, and industrial inputs that were overwhelmingly sourced from, shipped by, and financed through the American economy. The dollars did not just leave Washington and disappear. They cycled back into American industry, while Europe's survival became anchored to continued access to dollar funding. And behind the scenes, the rules of the post-war economy were being standardized around convertibility, open trade, and the dismantling of old imperial preference systems. The old closed-loop empires were being taken apart, not by invasion, by conditional finance. By the late 1940s, Britain is the clearest case study because it is the country that used to run the 19th century system. The City of London used to be the centre of global finance. Sterling used to be the world's key currency. Now Britain is fighting a war victory hangover with an empty wallet. In 1946, Britain signs a massive post-war loan agreement with the United States. The numbers vary depending on how you count the add-ons, but the core reality is the same. Britain is not being gifted a soft landing, it is being loaned survival. And a loan comes with conditions. The most dangerous condition was sterling convertibility, the demand that the pound be made freely convertible into dollars. Britain had spent the war building a protected sterling area, a closed loop where pounds could not easily be turned into dollars. That forced trade to flow through Britain. Convertibility would smash that loop. In July 1947, Britain tries to comply, and it plays out exactly like a run on a bank. The moment convertibility opens, holders of pounds rush to exchange them for dollars because dollars buy American goods, and American goods are what the world wants in a post-war shortage. Britain's dollar reserves begin bleeding out fast, so fast that within weeks the policy is suspended. That is what locked in looks like in real life. It is not a chain on a wrist. It is a country forced into decisions where every option leads back to the same constraint. You need dollars. And by 1949, the strain is visible in a single humiliating number. Britain devalues the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, it is an admission that the old world is over. Britain cannot defend its currency value because it cannot defend its balance of payments without dollars. Then the Cold War accelerates the lock even more because now the United States holds a second form of leverage over Europe. Security. If America is paying for the shield, America gets a louder voice in the rules. And those rules increasingly revolve around one thing: keeping the dollar-centered system stable enough to finance both defense and reconstruction. Rules. Europe begins rebuilding trade internally, but even those mechanisms are designed around the same hard truth. Dollars are scarce and essential. Europe creates clearing arrangements to conserve dollars because everyone is trying to survive inside the same constraint. You cannot import without dollars, and you cannot conjure dollars without access to the United States system. In 1950, Europe creates the European Payments Union, a mechanism designed to reduce the need for dollar payments inside Europe by netting out trade balances. That tells you everything. Payments. Even Europe's recovery tools were shaped by the dollar shortage. And as the 1950s move on, people call it recovery. Factories restart, ports rebuild, trade rises, wages stabilize, the lights come back on. But the deeper truth is that recovery now means functioning inside the dollar-based architecture designed in 1944. Because once you peg your stability to a reserve currency, you inherit its logic. You hold dollar reserves, you settle trade in dollars, you price key commodities in dollars. You build financial markets around dollar instruments. You align policy to avoid destabilizing the system you depend on. That is how a lock works, not by force, but by structure. And here is why this matters right now. People look at the modern world and assume the dollar is dominant simply because America is strong. That is only half true. The other half is path dependence. The system was cemented when Europe had no bargaining power, when it needed dollars to eat, to rebuild, to import fuel, to restart industry, when its alternatives were hunger, chaos, or Soviet alignment. So the post-war bill was paid in a currency arrangement that outlived the war itself. And if you want proof that it was never temporary, look at what happens in 1971. The United States closes the gold window. The dollar is no longer convertible into gold. The formal promise at the heart of Bretton Woods breaks. In a clean world, that would have shattered the system. Europe would have said, fine, new rules, new anchor. But it does not happen. The system morphs instead of dying. Because by then, Europe is already wired into dollar settlement, dollar reserves, and dollar-based global trade. The lock is not the gold promise anymore. It is the infrastructure. It is the networks. It is the accumulated dependence. The world keeps using the dollar because the world was rebuilt around the dollar. And once that wiring is in place, escaping it is not a speech. It is not a vote. It is not a treaty. It is a demolition job. You would have to replace payment rails, reserve management, commodity pricing, banking plumbing, and the deep habit of every institution on Earth reaching for dollars in a crisis. That is why the center holds even when the original contract is broken. Because what Bretton Woods really installed was not just a promise. It was a hierarchy, a world where one currency sits at the core, not because it is morally pure, but because history locked the structure into place when one side was desperate and the other side held the leverage. So when you hear the phrase, "The United States saved Europe," understand the full sentence. The United States saved Europe, and the price was that Europe rebuilt itself inside an American monetary order. That was the real bill. Not a one-time payment, a structural arrangement. And once you see that, you stop treating the post-war era as a clean victory story. You start seeing it as the moment the modern financial hierarchy was installed. Europe did not lose World War II, but it did lose the freedom to set the rules of global money. And that is why, even today, when crises hit, when liquidity disappears, when trade tightens, when confidence cracks, the world still rushes toward the same center. Because the lock was built when Europe was desperate. And desperate countries do not negotiate the future, they sign it.